Hi, this is Scott Garibay, and today we're going to talk about Dungeons & Dragons 5th Edition and Session 0, and really flipping the table on Session 0 and explaining why open communication is not a good idea and why Session 0 was never a good idea. And in my opinion, I have a really surprising bolstering of this theory, but coming at it from a completely different perspective. All right, so let's talk about this. All right, so first of all, I want to get my opinion on Session 0 out. I do not like Session 0. I think it's an absolutely terrible idea. I have never been in support of Session 0. In my opinion, Session 0 is a committee to hold a role-playing game. Nothing could be less fun. Nothing could be less useful. Now, the other one is, okay, let's talk about this, all right? So you're a dungeon master. You want to get 4 players at the table, right? Number goes up, number goes down. You know what I'm talking about, right? 4 players at the table. And so basically, you know, probably 1 or 2 of your people are already going to be no D&D. Fine. But 1 or 2 of your people might have just played once with a bad DM or have never played before, right? And so if you have a mixed group like that, which most people do, right? Trying to sell Dungeons & Dragons to somebody is so hard already, right? So let's get into that. Why is it hard? Well, it is very hard, right? You're like, hey, you want to come do this thing for me with 4 hours? And people are like, I don't do nothing for 4 hours, right? That's a blocker. And they're like, well, you know, so the questions will come up. And how long are we, like, I'm coming over this Saturday? No, you're coming over every Saturday forever. There's no end time. D&D games don't have, like, set lengths. So you could be doing this for the next 6 months or the next 6 years. We don't know. But all this is baked into D&D. It's so hard to get somebody in, right? They're like, okay, well, what do I need to do? You got 750 pages of reading to do, right? Like, at minimum, if you want to shortcut it, 250 pages, right? Like, the player's handbook alone is 250 pages, right? And honestly, in my opinion, every player should have read the PHB, the DMG, and the MM, right? And frankly, they should read Xanathar's and they should read Tasha's. Everybody got to read Tasha's now. Good grief! Like, you ain't building with Tasha's. You building with a suboptimal build. No two ways about it, right? So it's just, you know, tons of stuff to read. Huge time commitment. No existing end date. Like, this thing is already, you know, just getting somebody to a D&D table is, you're dragging them there anyway already. It's so hard, okay? And now you're like, oh, and guess what? Our first session, we're not going to play. We're just going to talk about playing. Session 0 is the absolute worst. It is just a terrible, horrible, just burning dumpster fire of an idea. It always has been, okay? Now, I'm the only person on the internet ever says this. Like, I never heard nobody roll at Session 0 and say Session 0 bad idea for XYZ reason. I just gave you my reasons. But wow, I heard the first person say, hey, Session 0 may not have ever been a good idea. And boy, was I shocked when I heard it. Who said it? Let's get into it. Woo! Jennifer Kretchmer. All right, so who's Jennifer Kretchmer? She is, in my opinion, she's on the short list to be a design lead for 6th edition. In addition to that, she is one of the new writers on Candlekeep Mysteries. Okay, she recently met with Todd Kenrick and did an official Wizards of the Coast Hasbro Gaming interview. Okay, and talked about accessibility in tabletop role-playing games. Okay, she did this with Todd Kenrick. Todd Kenrick is a D&D designer, official D&D designer. Right. What she said about Session 0 absolutely shocked me, and I was so delighted because I hate Session 0 for my reasons, but she rolled hard at Session 0 for her own reasons. And frankly, I will take anybody who's going to take an axe to the base of the tree on Session 0. I want Session 0 to die quick, right? And I think, fascinatingly, Jennifer Kretchmer gave one of the best reasons I've ever heard on why Session 0 should go away, right? All right, so let's get into it. Session 0. Ugh, it's so terrible. And I finally have somebody who's pulling the same rope in the same direction, but for a very, very different reason. Let's get into it. All right. Triggering traumas. That is Jennifer Kretchmer's reason why Session Zero is not great the way everybody thought. Okay, so I couldn't believe this. This interview with Jennifer Kretchmer and Todd Kenreck, so funny. So Todd Kenreck says the following. He says Session Zero is so important. Here's what he said. Todd Kenreck says Session Zero is so important, and we just really support that really here, with Dungeons and Dragons. I'm like, what? Like, okay, if Session Zero is important, why did it take 6 years to add it to an official book? Right? Like, it ain't important. It never was important for the game. It's being added now because it's in every indie game under the sun. Right? And so they're like, hey, there's one more thing we can throw into Tasha's whatever. Right? Session Zero, Todd Kenreck's like, oh, Session Zero is so important. Is it? Is that why it took 6 years to get it? And why there were literally 25 books before it was included in canon? Like, how important was it, Todd? It's ridiculous. All right, so let's go back to what Jennifer Kretchmer said. Jennifer Kretchmer said, yeah, you talked about Session Zero there and how everybody's going to talk about, their lines and veils and talk about X-Card. So if you don't know what lines and veils is, I'm going to explain it really, and X-Card is, I'll explain it really quick. Lines and veils, here's an example. A line would be a player in a Session Zero saying, no harm to animals. None. I don't want it in the game. I don't want villains harming animals. I don't want player characters harming animals. No harm to animals, period. That's a line, right? A veil would be a character saying, a player saying, I really love animals. I don't want to see any animals injured in this game, but I also realize we're playing a narrative game, and sometimes maybe a horse will get shot with an arrow or something. If a horse gets shot with an arrow, what I would like to do is, you as the dungeon master would say, oh, and an arrow goes astray and strikes a horse, okay? And then at that point, everybody's aware of it, but the dungeon master does not, like, oh, the horse bleeds and you hear its whinnying cry. Like, this would be triggering. This would be a triggering trauma for that player, right? So they can hear it once, but they're not going to sit there and this player is saying now in Session Zero, hey, I'm not gonna sit here and listen to like painstaking detail on the torture of a horse, right? Okay, that's a good example of lines and veils, or that's an example of, I think it's a good example of lines and veils. An X card is a card that people hold up, and they could say, hey, stop the game, right? Now, by the way, I do use X card in my game, and every single game, and I never, ever use Session Zero. I start every single game the same way. With my players, I say, hey, we're using this X card. If anything upsets you, hold up the X card, and that will tell me that something in the game is upsetting you. Often I'll understand that from context. If I don't, I may ask you, if I'm not sure what's triggering a trauma for you, then we may go into the other room and I'll ask you privately, or if I feel it's appropriate, I may ask you here. So that's what an X card is, right? In addition to that, I also say, hey, listen, everybody, we are all fellow human beings. Everyone will speak respectfully to each other as humans, and we will also speak respectfully to each other as player characters. In my games, no player character is an enemy to you. In fact, these are your best buds, and you will treat them with kindness and respect, in character and out of character. Takes 2 minutes. I don't waste 4 hours of people's time dragging them out to talk about playing a role-playing game. Session Zero is the worst, right? It's literally 2 sentences. Go forward. Let's do this, right? And and it's served extremely well. I've never had a problem, right? But I'm so excited to hear Jennifer Kretchmer roll hard at Todd Kenreck and just like, boy, she took it to him. I loved hearing it. She's like, hey, you aware that, like, I'm paraphrasing here, but this was the gist of what she said, in my opinion. She's like, are you aware that, like, Session Zeros are just a big, long session of asking people to talk about their traumas publicly? And maybe that's a bad idea? And I was like, what? I did a double take. I was like, is somebody talking some serious smack about session 0? I am here for that. Like, you know, and I was like, yeah, exactly. Like, and I was like, holy cows. Like, you know, Jennifer Kretchmer, I will tell you right now, I'm very excited about hearing her voice in Dungeons and Dragons going forward. Because she says stuff ain't nobody saying. And I was fascinated, right? So, like, she's like, yeah, that's a bad idea. So the way we do that in my game, and I love this, right? This is Jennifer Kretchmer. She's got one section in one book coming out. Todd Krennic's like been on staff for like 5 years. And she's like, listen up, this is how it's done. Right? I was like, whoa, man. Right? And so she says, what we do is we open up an anonymous Google Doc, and everybody, so before a campaign launches off, there's an anonymous Google Doc. Everybody puts in their traumas and, you know, all the stuff they don't want in the game in that Google Doc privately, right? And then we go into the game knowing that information privately, but nobody had to publicly state their trauma. Nobody was asked to publicly state their traumas and talk openly, publicly about things they don't like and want. What? This is like, oh my gosh. I was like, yes, you're right. Session 0 is terrible for a whole long list of reasons. And everyone who's been doing Session 0s has just been triggering their traumas of their players for a long time. And of us, those who were not running Session 0 and just asking people to respect people as human beings in and out of characters and doing the same thing in 3 sentences, were saving triggering traumas for their players. Like, I'm like, yes, this is a, you know, Session 0 is terrible for a host of reasons. We can all dislike Session 0 for different reasons. I love that she's collecting checks on everybody out there who's been running these horrible Session 0s for a long time. For totally different reasons than me, but finally, there's somebody pulling that rope of Session 0 stinks with me. You know, and the other thing I thought was really fascinating, man, Jennifer Kretchmer is a freaking genius. She's saying stuff that nobody is saying. It also brings up the question, right? Every tin pot D&D commentator on the internet is saying, openly discuss with your players. She's the first one to say, no, open communication is not the end-all be-all of good DMing, right? In fact, closed communication, secret communication, that is where good dungeon mastering starts. Woo! That is a hot take, right? And actually, I really agree with that. Like, basically, I'm so sick to death of hearing so many D&D commentators being like, open communication, open communication, open communication. No, maybe keep your mouth shut and play just play the game, right? Make it clear that everybody needs to respect each other, spend 3 sentences on it, and move on, right? Like, and the idea like that basically, because a lot of times what's happening is you can't fix jerk, right? And that's the problem that nobody's really talking about, is sometimes you got a jerk in the middle of your game, right? And no Session 0 is going to fix that, in my opinion, right? You're still going to end up with a jerk on the other end of that Session 0, and that's still going to need to be managed by the Dungeon Master. But the difference is you're not going to waste, 4 people plus you, 2 hours for, you're not going to waste 10 hours of trying to get your game running, and also massively disincentivize people from playing in your game. I am so there for everything Jennifer Kretchmer is saying, and I think she's really taking the game in a new way, right? First of all, she's just throwing every D&D commentator out there is like, open communication is the greatest thing that can be in there. Maybe you're just triggering traumas for your players, right? Like, and maybe you should just talk less, right? And maybe secret communication, right, and closed communication is the future of the game. I ain't never heard that from nobody. That's new. That is very, very new, right? And also, here's a design. Here's somebody coming out, a D&D. Here is a tabletop role-playing game designer coming out and just going hard at the whole community. people would not shut up about open communication. And she's like, nope, secret communication, closed communication. Love it. Fascinating, right? Totally agree with her. I think session zeros were just 6 years of people wasting time triggering traumas for their players. Kill the conceptual bugbear of the session zero. Any way it goes away, I'm great. I'm great with it, right? And the reality is, I don't consider putting information into a document a session zero, right? I don't know what that is, but I don't think it's a session zero. And if it deforms or mangles or gets rid of session zero, I'm all for it. And I also love the idea of recognizing that triggering traumas is really what was happening in session zeros. Because I'm on record right here on this channel of saying session zero is a bad idea from day one, right? I also love the idea that D&D put session zero into a book here, hired a writer who comes here and says session zero is a terrible idea. I was like, that's great. I love it. This is like so dramatic. I love it. Woo! It's getting spicy. It is getting spicy. So down for every word coming out of Jennifer Kretchmer's mouth. She is fascinating and is super intelligent. And I think she really might be the chosen one. She might be the Kate Welch replacement. Very, very interesting. Well, that's my opinion. And also, I want to remind you, watch for Candlekeep Mysteries. That's where you're going to see Jennifer Kretchmer's work. Well, that's my opinion. What do you think? Do you still, even after hearing Jennifer Kretchmer's brilliant revelation that session zero is just DMs triggering traumas for their players publicly? Or do you agree with me? Session zero was always a bad idea, and the faster we get rid of it, the better. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Let me know in the comments below. Please consider liking and subscribing, and have a wonderful millennium.